Welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about everyone's favorite topic, outlining. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Allison Monahan, that's me, and Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the Catapult Career Conference, and I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started.
Welcome back. Today we're talking about outlining and other study aids, which are important in helping you make sense of everything you're learning in law school. This episode is based on a question we got from a listener who wrote the following. I tried to begin outlining my courses today and realized that I have no idea what I'm doing. Everybody online and at my school talks about outlining as if everybody knows what it entails, but I don't think most of my 1L class has a clue where to begin. How should it be organized? What's important to include? What's not necessary to include? How much time should it take? How often should it be updated? When should you begin? And frankly, what exactly is it? These are all questions for which I have no answers. It seems like the 1Ls at my school live in a bubble and don't get much interaction with the upperclassmen who have actually done this before. It is like the blind leading the blind. Wow, these are great questions. So we just thought we should just take these questions and talk about them.
Yeah, so see if you write in, your questions might actually get answered. Because I think this is something we hear a lot from law students, like, oh yeah, I should be outlining, so... what exactly is that? So first off, Lee, what exactly is an outline? And is this the only way you could possibly organize your study materials?
Well, I think an outline, there's the approach of an outline, which is just one document that houses all of the law that you have learned in your class and what you need to know for your exam. But what I think the terminology where it becomes kind of complicated is a lot of people use outline to reference just any study materials that they have made to support their final exam study for a given class. It doesn't have to be the word formatted, Roman numeral 1, A, B, C, 1, 2, 3. It could be flowcharts. It could be diagrams. It could be a lot of different things. I think the important thing about an outline as it's used in the law school context is really the fact that you just have some sort of place, document, central notebook where you house your understanding of the law and what was discussed in your classes so you can prepare for exams.
Yeah, and I think the reason you have to do this, which I remember being sort of confused about, I was like, I've never had something that had all of my information for a whole class, like maybe I had class notes or whatever, but I was like, why do I need to do this? But it makes sense if you think about the way that the pedagogy of law school works, which is that what you're reading is not kind of like the history of the law. Like you might read, the history of the United States if you were taking an undergraduate history class. But what you're reading is these cases, and each case gives you one tiny little snippet of the law. You can think of it like a brick in the wall. So, if you're trying to build your house of the law, each case might be one brick. But you've got to kind of figure out how to put these together and that kind of thing. So to really stretch the analogy, you can think of the outline maybe as your blueprint for how you're going to build the house.
Such an architecture master's person's description of an outline.
Exactly. I mean, certainly in architecture school, no one was talking to me about outlines, And one of the things I think can be helpful, I think it's useful to think of there are kind of two separate purposes here. And so when you talk about this perfectly formatted, and gosh, how much time do people spend formatting their outlines? Don't do that.
Colors.
Don't do that.
Bold.
Do not get obsessed. If you find yourself getting obsessed about the formatting of Roman numeral AA125, you're probably wasting time. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I think there are kind of two big picture things you're trying to do. One is you've got to make sense of this material in some meaningful way. And so that involves, really kind of going back and being okay, what was the point of this class? What was the point of this case? Are there gaps in my knowledge? Do I understand or not understand, how the big picture works? And then what are the details? So you've got to kind of, got to spend that time really going through this and making it make sense. But then you also want to think about how you're going to document this so that you can use it later. And it doesn't matter really if you have a closed book or an open book exam. Like, you're going to need some sort of reference, either memorized or basically memorized. So, I often tell people to think of outlining as like this iterative process. You're not going to probably have some final document that's perfect. That's not the point. We're not trying to get a gold star for having the prettiest outline or the longest outline. But you've got to make sense of this material and then somehow document that so that you don't forget it, basically, by the time the exam rolls around.
Right, because your professor's not just going to give you, typically, all of the rule statements that you need to know, how all of the law fits together, what sort of attack plan you need to have in your back pocket to approach questions. You're not getting given this material. One of the things that makes law school so difficult is it is actually your job to synthesize the material and organize it in a way that makes sense to you. Of course, there are resources, right? That's what supplements do. That's what commercial outlines do. But you're really probably not going to be able to just pull like a Gilbert's off the shelf and just say, oh, here's my contracts outline, because your class is going to be slightly different. Your professor's picking and choosing the cases that they want to learn. And this shouldn't be shocking when you think about some of the egos of your law professors. They actually want what was taught in their class to be regurgitated back to them on the exam.
Right, and oftentimes what they choose to test you on might be some variant of like a law review article they've recently written or something like that, which I can pretty much guarantee you is not going to be in your off-the-shelf Glennon's. Not to say that those can't be useful. In fact, we have an entire podcast episode on using supplements responsibly, which we highly recommend you listen to. But, those can get you, depending on the class, they can get you pretty far or not very far at all. Some professors are very, very idiosyncratic. Mm-hmm. And, but even, the interesting thing there is sometimes they are very idiosyncratic in class, but then they give a very standard type of exam.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite stories. Was we were tutoring a student who was at an Ivy League school, and he was taking criminal law. And his professor was all about criminal theory. They talked about, the right of the government to punish people and, all these theories about crime and punishment. And then I asked him if he'd pulled any practice exams for this class, and he did. And he sent one to me, and I said, great, why don't you go ahead and do it? And he sent me back this answer that was all about crime and punishment theory. And the question was literally like, is someone guilty of murder 1 or felony murder? And I'm like, do you have any idea like what this law is or how you're supposed to answer these questions? And he was kind of like, they want me to do what?
Oh no, that was what my Civ Pro class was like. I remember the first day the professor basically walked in and said, well, I gotta be honest, I find the rules here like kind of boring, so you should just like read the rules of civil procedure. I'm not going to assign them. You should just read them on your own and kind of, try to understand them. I'm more interested in, like this theory of this or that or blah, blah, blah. And so the whole class was basically spent on these like very esoteric things. And then exactly, you pull the sample exam and you're like, oh my gosh, it's like, is there personal jurisdiction?
And you're like, where was I supposed to find that again?
Yeah, like, wait, did we like discuss this? And so in that situation, you basically, that's where a supplement can really come in handy. Obviously, you want to give your professors like what they're looking for, but often what they're looking for in class is really different from what they're looking for in the exam. Point being, anytime you're working on an outline, you're thinking about outlining study aids, you've got to keep your eye on the prize.
Right.
And if you're trying to outline without ever having looked at a sample exam for this class, I think that's a really bad idea.
Absolutely. One of the most common questions I think we get about outlining, other than how to do it, is how do I know if I'm doing it right?
Right.
And the way you learn whether or not you're doing it right is you test the outline. If you have an outline next to you and you have a practice question and you cannot answer the practice question with your outline next to you, then your outline is broken.
It is not working
and it's not working for you.
And you need to change it.
And you need to change it. And so maybe it's that outlining as a process isn't how you can make the law understand or make sense to you. Then you need to come up with a new solution. But testing the outline and not waiting until reading days to test the outline is a very important piece of this process.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes people just don't, like, I don't know if they're intimidated or they think it's pointless or what, but they just don't look at sample exams. And I think that's a real mistake, because you want to understand, like, what are you going to be asked to do so that you can work backwards and figure out, well, what would help me do that? Mm-hmm. So one of the things we talk about a lot with our students is having an attack plan. Like, say it's a criminal law exam. I can pretty much guarantee you with almost 100% certainty that there will be a dead body.
I bet more than one.
Yeah, at least
probably
one, but probably more than one dead body on your crim law exam. Like, if you don't have a dead body, you can write me an email and like I'll send you a Starbucks card, because basically it's going to happen. Same thing in Civ Pro. If you are taking a Civ Pro exam, I can almost 100% guarantee you will be asked to talk about personal jurisdiction.
Yeah.
So these are things where it's like, you might be able to tell me, oh, the law of personal jurisdiction, there's this case called International Shoe, there's this other case called Worldwide Volkswagen, there's this other case called, something vaguely like Japanese, Asahi, you may know these cases, you may be able to tell me exactly what each one says, but if I present you with a scenario of like, someone got in a car accident across state lines with a Brazilian entrepreneur who has happened to be passing through the U.S. and has never set foot in the state otherwise, but happens to have, a website that does business and blah, blah. Like, that's what you're going to be asked to analyze. The question is, does your outline help you do that?
Right. Exactly. So let's get down a little bit to the nitty gritty then. I mean, when a student is ready to outline, and we kind of recommend that this process starts maybe like a month into classes.
Yeah, people often wait way too late to start this. Again, maybe it's intimidation, maybe it's just not having time,
Or making time.
This is something we talk about in the time management podcast is, you really have to make the time for this deep work. And certainly at this point, you're more than a month into school, you have done some topics, you can start doing your outlines. Do not keep waiting.
Right. So
until you have more information.
Exactly. So hopefully you've listened to our time management podcast, and you know that you're supposed to have a space for deep work set aside every single week. And this is exactly where the outlining should probably happen, is during the deep work time.
Yeah. And I think, ideally you've mapped out some deep work category on your schedule, but now this is the time that you start filling in, well, what am I really going to do there? You look at your classes. Okay, where's a class that we've really covered like a very specific topic? Maybe it's personal jurisdiction or subject matter jurisdiction or, I don't know, mens rea, like whatever it is. If you're a few weeks in, you've covered something at this point.
Exactly.
And so it's time to really start committing to, okay, I'm going to outline class X on Saturday afternoon.
And so when you're ready to outline, the first thing you need to go is get your materials together.
Yeah, so what do people
collect
need?
Our stuff.
Yeah, exactly. You're not going to do this in a vacuum. You're probably going to end up with like in a room with lots of papers spread around you.
Exactly. So you need your class notes. And if you've taken our advice, those class notes are probably handwritten in a nice little notebook, maybe even a Circa notebook. Who knows?
Maybe you've highlighted what you did in each class and why it was important.
Right. But
maybe
you're going to
have like notes on the law and what your professor said. We hope so.
We hope so. So you're going to have your class notes. You're probably going to have your computer. I mean, I don't think that outlines need to be done on the computer, but I know a lot of students like to do it. Again, I think the danger zone of the computer is getting so caught up in all the formatting and all the little like nifty tips and tools that Word will do for you to
or Evernote
or wherever you're doing
OneNote, whatever.
So
I've seen some beautiful OneNote outlines that looked great and were totally pointless.
Yeah. So I think it's really up to you, but again, think about how you learn. If the computer is a huge distraction, if you get caught up in things like formatting and things like that, maybe you want to try handwriting your outlines. It's a totally valid way to do it.
I always did. I never did one on the computer. Like, I would borrow ones from either old outlines, like old student outlines, or sometimes if I had a really good friend, like they would give me theirs. But, I always did mine on paper just because I found it helped me focus on like what's really important, because you just can't, it's like exactly the same thing as class notes. Like, you can't write everything.
And I made the mistake sometimes of actually having way too robust of outlines, and then I would end up doing, and those would be typed and too long. So then I would have to do a handwritten one after that, because that was really the only way for me to start to make the material my own. And the other beauty of handwriting, we just do not have the patience to handwrite things as long as we will type them. And so it forces you to synthesize, because you're not going to, I've seen 100-page outlines, 100 and some page outlines. No one is going to handwrite out 100-page outlines.
No, God, no.
That was like an awful
that
waste of time.
That would be a total waste of time.
Okay, so what else does a student need? Maybe a supplement or a horn book?
I would say definitely one supplement or horn book, probably not an E&E, examples and explanations. I think this is the place where you go for your classic like Emmanuel's, Gilbert's, or Glannon's, Or you go to the library and you get a horn book. The problem with the horn book is they probably have too much information.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you were trying to outline from Prosser on torts,
yeah, that's probably not going to get you very far.
You're just going to find yourself, it's kind of like reading the encyclopedia. Like, oh, this is so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But like, we really are trying to kind of nail it down, to the basic detail. So, I think people should have one commercial outline and or horn book, probably commercial outline. Typically you're going to have your textbook with you, but you really shouldn't be referring back to it.
Or rereading cases. Please don't do that.
Yeah, don't read. Even like case briefing, like maybe your briefs, like you want to glance at them. But typically here, you're not trying to reread a bunch of stuff. You're trying to really pull out the most critical information.
Yeah, you're looking for the takeaways from the class.
So if you find yourself like, oh, I was a little confused about the dissent in some case, let me reread it. That is a waste of time.
Yeah.
So basically, you want to have like that commercial outline, your class notes, and then this other stuff is kind of extraneous. So you probably want to have, if you have access to it, at least 1 or 2 old student outlines for this professor in this course. Mm-hmm. I caution you, however, don't think you can just sort of take that and add a little bit to it.
Oh, putting your name on the top of it?
Yeah, or like changing the formatting.
Right, that doesn't make it your own?
Because the point is, someone who made this beautiful 100-page outline and got an A in the class, they went through the process of making that. So they actually understood it. I mean, I know, Lee, you've got a story about like thinking you're going to borrow some A+ outline and looking at it and just being like, oh my gosh, this is like, I literally can't even understand what this is saying.
Oh yeah. I mean, my friend high scored the class and I was like, sweet, I am golden. It was employment law. And I opened up that outline and went, I cannot even follow what's in this outline.
Or oftentimes even little stuff. Like it actually, for whatever reason, drove me completely insane if people use symbols for plaintiff and defendant.
Oh, it's funny.
Which like everyone does because who wants to keep typing it out. But it drove me nuts. Like I just couldn't look at something that had that in it without wanting to kill myself.
But I could never get into doing those on the computer because I felt like it took so much time. I was always like, who spends a lot of time like looking up the symbol to insert it?
Yeah, that's true.
I would just do P and D.
Yeah, I know the ones who did like the delta. I was like, because I never could remember. I was like, because it's like this process. You're like, okay, delta D defendant, and like every single time I looked at it, I had to go through that 3-step. I'm like, just freaking write out the word.
Or P and D. P and D word. Yeah.
So people are very idiosyncratic in the way that they process information. So I think it's useful to have old outlines so that you can see how someone structured it and kind of get a sense of like, okay, this probably, but again, like the person might think about it totally differently than you do.
Yeah.
So the other thing is you can sort of see, like, have you left stuff out?
Mm-hmm.
Although, again, like your professor might not have covered that topic that year. But it gives you a red flag if there's like a whole section that you're like, oh, I don't really remember talking about that.
Yeah, it's time to go back to your syllabus and see if you missed the boat on something.
Yeah, were you like asleep in class one day or did you really not cover this?
I think it's also really important to do this kind of ongoing. We talk about starting this like a month in because then you're going to be able to do it in digestible chunks. And I think one of the things that can be really intimidating is if you wait too long, you're like, where do I start? And it's like, well, you should start at the very beginning. You should start at the first section of your syllabus when you finish talking about something. And that's when you know that it's a good time to start. If you come to outlining, late in the semester and you have hundreds and hundreds of pages of class notes, it's going to be hard to know where to start.
Well, the other thing is you're going to get better at this as you go. So you want to give yourself time to kind of like flail in the beginning and get really frustrated and not have any clue what you're doing, but then maybe go get some help from someone or talk to a professor, maybe bring in a section of the outline to office hours and just be like, hey, this is what I'm working on. Like, do you think this makes sense? Are there questions you have about something? Because if it's a reading week, nobody's going to be talking to you. Like, the professor's not even going to have office hours at that point. They're going to be like, sorry, you should have been doing this 3 months ago.
Yeah, and they're not going to be
sympathetic.
Welcome to answer those questions. I think a lot of times students get frustrated with professors because they go at the end of the semester and they're like, I have 25 questions for my outline. And the professor's like, I don't have time.
Yeah, like look at the line of students who also have 25
but
questions.
If you go early in the semester when they are bored in their office hours, it is highly
no
likely.
one else is there.
Yeah, it's highly likely they're going to answer your questions and kind of indulge you in a discussion that they wouldn't do otherwise.
Yeah, because it makes it look like you're trying, you're on the game, they feel sympathy for you because you're just really don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
So basically, they're going to be more likely to help you. All right, so we've got our materials. We're looking at the blank page. What do I write down?
Well, here's what you don't write down. Let's start with what you don't write down.
All right.
What you don't write down is my personal pet peeve when I see a student's outline, which is what we call the mini briefs. What an outline is not is a collection of mini briefs
Case
about
summaries.
every case that you have read in your class. And if I see another outline across my desk that says personal jurisdiction, and then it literally is like bullet point number 1,
International
shoe, and then like, here's the facts of international shoe here, which I don't even remember.
Yeah,
I can tell you what international shoe is about, but I have no recollection.
I don't know. I think it was like a factory or something.
Worldwide's Volkswagen. I feel like that had to do with a car, but like that's only because it says Volkswagen in the title.
Yeah, we're really going off of the titles here. I'm like, the shoe company probably had something to do with shoes.
Probably international shoe.
Volkswagen probably had to do with cars.
With a car, yeah. So the point is that it doesn't matter really what the details of this case are.
We don't care what color the car was.
No, we do not. We do not. And so what students get caught up on is being able to recite the specifics of the case. And that's not really where the outlining magic happens. The outlining magic happens with this idea that you are pulling out what was the important thing about that case. Why was that case included in your case book?
You want to focus on the law. You're
looking for the law, the black letter law, or the reason that case was included. Some cases are included to explain how the law is applied.
Right, exactly. Like the hand formula. You probably read this in torts.
Right.
The case has something to do with the barge, as I vaguely recall. But the barge is not the point. We don't care about the barge.
Right.
We only care about the hand formula.
And I don't think it's about a hand. No, so don't talk about a hand.
No.
Hand surgery. No, not.
No,
about
that's where a learned hand might lead you astray. That is a judge.
Yes, that is a judge. It is a judge, not the facts. But again, like some of these facts are really memorable, but mostly it's the rules or what these cases stand for, that's what you want. And so instead of filling your outline with mini briefs, don't worry. It's not like your case notes or your class notes are going anywhere. You can always reference them during this final exam period if there's some reason you need to.
Well, and you can always include, like, for example, a case name in the outline,
right,
if it's very critical. Like, I think you probably should at some point write, international shoe, just because when you refer to that case name, your professor is like, oh, okay, I'm in a world that I understand. However, it's not sufficient just to write down the name. You basically have to say, as we saw in international shoe, blah, 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 rule of law.
Right.
This now I'm going to apply it. Like you can't get away with just like name dropping and think that's enough.
No, I mean, I think some classes, the cases can be very important as far as what the facts are. If that's true, then you can include some of the facts, but we're talking about like a sentence or a few words, and the case about the barge, the case
but
where...
even there, I'm like, no one cares about the barge. You only care about the form. But like con law or something,
Con law, crim, sometimes.
If you're doing a lot of like analogizing to the facts of specific cases, then and this is sort of what you have to kind of figure out with your outlines is different classes might require different approaches.
Right. So let's say we're talking about heat of passion defenses in crim. If you're arguing that should apply, you might, need to know fact patterns that you covered in class of what qualifies as the heat of passion and what doesn't.
Right. And a lot of times it'll be like, there'll be different tests or for like insanity. I think there's like the McNaughton tests for insanity and some other tests for insanity. Like that's a good example of where like the actual cases really matter because they've created a test that you need to be able to apply. But, I couldn't tell you one case name that relates to the heat of passion,
No, I do remember there was a case where someone tried to choke their wife with a telephone cord.
Yeah, crumb. Gotta love those.
It could be some dark stuff in those cases. Dark stuff.
Yeah, and so, I think this is always a balance. It's like you've got to focus first on the law, but then if you're going to, to bump yourself up on the curve, can't hurt to throw in like a little fancy stuff about some cases. But if you find your outline just being like case A, here's what happened. Case B, here's what happened. Case C, here's what happened. That is a total waste of time.
And that is really where it comes back to looking at the exams and seeing what you need to know, trying to look at the model answers, seeing what the professor likes. If the professor likes lots of case names, if the professor likes lots of discussion of facts.
Sometimes they'll tell you.
And then sometimes they'll tell you if you go to office hours and talk to them about it, that's going to cue you what you need. But what is important is you realize that the outlining process, no matter how your professor tests, is all about taking that step back, coming at this from a much higher level and not getting lost in the details of, was this the case about the telephone cord or the case about the hammer?
Well, and I think they'll do that because, frankly, that's easier.
Yeah.
It's easier just to think like, oh, I just have to go through the cases we read and make my case briefs, like basically retype them, and then I'll know everything
using outline format in order.
I'll retype what I already wrote in my case brief and put it in an outline, and then I'll obsess over whether my like indentations are italicized, and then I'll do well in the test.
I mean, guys, this is hard stuff. I mean, this is where the magic happens in law school. This is going to be hard. There are going to be some sections of the law that you've covered that you're going to struggle with. The struggle is real, but it is something that you need to lean into and really embrace and not run away from and just say, well, I'm just going to write down, page after page of outlines, and I'm sure that at some point it'll sink in. That's
another one I love. Like, well, I just figured it would come together at some point. People kept telling me everything would just fall into place.
Come together.
It's like, yeah, it doesn't, like, this isn't magic.
No,
you can't wave a wand and just be like, it only falls into place if you really dig into it.
Yeah.
And really like try to understand what you're doing in a smart way.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that's sort of true. I mean, I was a Civ Pro TA, and I did tell people like, there will be a moment if you're lucky and like you're, doing what you need to be doing, where suddenly the entire system actually makes sense. Mm-hmm. But you have to work up to that point by really like digging into all of the different pieces so you can see how they fit together. And then maybe you get that moment of clarity where you're like, oh my gosh, I totally get it.
Yeah.
And that's a great moment.
Yeah.
But you want to record like everything you just thought so you don't forget it like a week later.
It's true. I mean, Ariel, a tutor on our team, has this really great blog post. I think it's in the bar space, but it applies to everything. That is like, you should be doing what makes yourself uncomfortable. What makes you feel uncomfortable when you're studying, because that means that you're challenging yourself and you're learning. If you're just sitting there going like, I outlined for 5 hours. It was super easy. I did 20 pages.
Meaning I took someone else's old outline and retyped it or colored in or like filled in a few things. I mean, that's just not that helpful.
No.
And maybe, sometimes if you're really in a pinch, like, grab someone else's old outline. If you've been sick for 3 weeks before exams and you're desperate, like you can, you might be able to get through. But given that you have more time at this point, it's better really to sort of start from scratch and try to make this material your own.
Yeah, we're not trying to talk about the triage plan here. We're talking about the best case scenario plan.
Yeah, this is like everything's going to go great.
Yeah, exactly.
You're going to start outlining in October. Yeah. Everything's going to be, you're going to have plenty of time. You're going to be caught up. No, there's a completely different strategy for triage, which I think we probably have some podcasts on.
Yeah, exactly.
You're a week out and it's a total mess. You're not necessarily going to fail. But
exactly.
Better to, do this piece by piece, bit by bit, stay on top of it. I mean, even if somebody has, say, 4 classes, even if they're outlining 2 classes every other week, I mean, you're still going to be like several weeks of material in each class. You say you did like 1 class on Saturday, 1 class on Sunday, and you did that consistently for the whole semester. You're still looking at several weeks of material in each class.
Yeah.
Minimum 2 weeks per class. Like that's still going to be a lot. I mean, that's going to be multiple hours every Saturday and every Sunday. So that gives you a sense of like, if you don't get started on this now, whoo.
Yeah.
Boy. It's going to be ugly.
Yeah. All right, so what happens if the student sits down, takes our advice, has all their stuff around them, and then looks at that blank page and just kind of scratches their head and is like, I do not know what should be written down on the page?
Well, I'd say number 1 is just write something. And
contracts.
No, I mean, literally, like it is a totally valid place to start, to go to your syllabus or go to the table of contents in your book and look, it says contracts. Offer. And you could literally write down contracts, offer, and whatever the subheaders are. That probably gives you a pretty good starting point.
Yeah.
It's not like you have to recreate the wheel here. But I mean, some professors are just really all over the place. And I think that's when you pull out, the commercial outline and you sort of look at what they've done. I mean, you only look at the sections that you've covered, but basically that's going to give you a pretty good idea of where to get started. This is also a good place. I mean, I'm not sure I'd go like straight to my professor if I'm like,
your class doesn't make sense.
Your class isn't really making sense. I don't know how to start outlining. Could you show me how? They're going to be like, no,
leave my office.
But your TA might be more helpful if you have a TA in a class. Like they're much closer to this experience. I mean, I remember when I was a Civ Pro TA, I ended up giving people some handwritten outlines that I'd done. I mean, they were begging for them. And I was like, look, I don't think this is actually going to be that helpful to you, to be honest, because the 3 pages I'm showing you took me 12 hours to actually create. But hey, if you want it, like, here it is. Yep. I'm not going to tell you can't have it. You know, send it to the whole section. Yeah. Who cares?
Exactly. Let's talk about something not to do, which is divide up the outline amongst your study group and only do that. One part. That is
like one class.
Or one class. That is just a terrible idea. That's the same thing as just taking somebody else's outline and putting your name on it. I don't actually think it's a bad thing if you all want to outline and then you guys want to kind of compare your outlines and make sure you didn't miss anything. I think that's fine because you've already done the heavy lifting.
Right. And I think it's fine if people don't know where to get started. If you have a study group that you might want to sort of sit down with and kind of talk about how to get started. Like, well, what do you think is most critical here? Like, how would you start writing this outline? That is a completely valid and useful use of time. But when you decide like, oh, well, I'll just do contracts and you can do torts and you can do Civ Pro and then we'll trade them at the end, we'll all have this amazing outline because we'll spend all of our time doing one class, so we'll just get the other 2 bonus. It's like, yeah, you're probably gonna do really well on that one exam, but you're unlikely to do very well on the ones that you're basically like stealing someone else's work for.
Yeah. I mean, it just there's no easy shortcut around this stuff. You just have to do the work.
Yeah, you basically have to do the work. And, you're better off doing a relatively good outline in all 3 of your classes yourself versus a completely perfect one that's going to be like the example outline for years to come in one class and doing nothing in the other 2. Because, I mean, think about it. If you get, a B+ or an A- in 3 classes versus getting an A and 2 Cs, I mean, yeah, one of those is a better looking GPA.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes academic support will have workshops on outlining.
Yeah, I think it's good to go to that.
I mean, sometimes they're anxiety inducing.
Yeah, obviously I would take them with a grain of salt. They may give you really terrible advice. Yeah. To each his own.
Yeah, exactly. And if you really are lost, this is another place where, like our tutors spend a lot of time with their students kind of figuring out how the outlining process works for the individual, because that can be really challenging.
Yeah, and I think it can be useful just to have some sort of expert resource. I mean, I know you had parents who were lawyers. I don't know if they ever looked at your outlines, but having some, whether it's a tutor or a TA or even like a trusted upper class person who can look at this and kind of be like, I don't think this is going to be that helpful.
Yeah.
And here's why.
Yeah.
Because until you have tested it thoroughly, you just don't know.
No.
I mean, I think you can definitely get pretty far by trying to take a practice exam, looking at your outline. And as you said, if you can't answer the question.
Yeah, that's a fundamental problem.
Yeah. So you might be able to identify that, hey, there's a problem here. Whereas how to fix that, I mean, I think that's the hard part for people, because if you did something not that useful to start with, how do you know how to fix it?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that.
No.
I think you have to get outside input.
Yeah. So what if you're one of these people who tries to do this kind of linear outline process and it is just not working?
Oh gosh, I could imagine being that kind of person because I am that kind of person. And I read some books about law school, and I had this roommate who's completely the opposite. She loved her 100-page outline and perfectly typed. And I was just look at this. I'm like, this is insane. This just does not seem helpful to me. And so for me, one of the things I found super, super helpful that I think were extremely effective, also very, very time consuming to make, but very effective once they were made, particularly since I had open book exams, for me were flowcharts. So I hated contracts, for example, but I still to this day have 3 or 4 pages of contracts flowcharts that basically enabled me to do really well in the class. Yeah. And they're very specific and they're very but they're simple at the same time. And that's sort of the beauty of the flowcharts. It forces you to make everything basically a yes, no, or possibly maybe question. Uh-huh. So it's did this happen? Okay, yes, no, maybe. I did one for crim, I remember, about a scenario, if someone in the problem is drugged, or there's possible drugs or drinking or whatever. And that 1-page flowchart, I could look at it today, and if you gave me a hypo, I'd be like, okay, well, is this a crime that requires X? Okay, follow this line of thinking. Right. Is it a crime that requires Y? Okay, was this voluntary or involuntary? I could still do that analysis, which I don't think I could do with just a random typed up outline.
Yeah. a lot of this is one of the reasons why we want you to start early is you kind of want to try this stuff out. I mean, you may not know that flowcharts are your answer, but maybe you should try and make one, and see if that does make more sense to you. Or, flashcards are something that can either be a big benefit or they can be a huge time waster, time suck.
Yeah, I think the warning we have about flashcards is it encourages that kind of like brick in the wall approach. We're like, okay, great, you can memorize all of the relevant words. Right. You have a flashcard that tells you what summary judgment says, like what it is. Does that help you when your professor asks you to analyze if something is ripe for summary judgment?
Right.
Probably not.
And making flashcards is like notorious busy work. We see this in law school. We see this in the bar space. I spent 20 hours making these flashcards. And it's like, well, that's great. Did you learn anything during those 20 hours?
Yeah. And you can buy some of these pre-made, but then, we have to caution you the same thing we caution with a commercial outline. Like, okay, yes, like law in a flash or whatever might be helpful to you, but it's not going to be as helpful as figuring this out on your own.
Exactly.
Checklists can be kind of a useful tool for a lot of people.
Things to memorize, tell you how to do stuff.
Yeah, all the intentional torts. Like, do you want to think about all of these? That kind of thing. Yep. For certain very specific types of legal problems, I think tables can be really useful. Say, for example, you're taking evidence and there's California rules and federal rules. Or in contracts, you have common law versus the UCC or something like that. Model penal code versus the common law. So anytime you have these important distinctions, I think having a way to track them, and often a table with like different colors, like California is always red, federal is always black. And so that can actually help your mind because you may literally see that page if you're like struggling to remember which is which in your head and be like, oh, it's red. Okay, it's California.
Yeah, exactly.
So, these might be supplements to your other outlines. There are lots of different ways to do this, but I think getting out of that mindset of like, oh, it just has to be this typed up document that I use a bunch of like, A's and I's and whatever on is the only way to do it. The important thing is, does this help you answer an exam question?
Right. And always remember that these are living, breathing documents. Like this first pass you're going to do at it doesn't necessarily have to be the end all be all. It's not like you can't go back and revisit this material.
Well, and you probably should. And this is what I was talking about earlier with iteration. Like maybe you do make this really long document because you're trying to make sense of the material and you don't know what's important. But then you decide, as you did, Lee, like, okay, I've got this, overly long document. Basically anything over about 30 pages is probably too long for a 1L class. That. People will walk in with like a 150-page outline. You're like, really? That's a book. Yeah. But, maybe you have this longer document that you then cut down as you get more comfortable with the material until it's, maybe you have your 20 to 30-page outline. And then in the week before the exam, you make a 1 to 2-page cheat sheet that you're actually going to memorize. Yeah. Or have in front of you on an open book. Because people on open book exams think like, oh, no problem. I have a 100-page outline. Everything's in there. It's like, yeah, you have 3 hours. Do you really want to spend that time flipping through, like looking for something? That is not a great plan.
No. Bad use of time. I think we did a podcast on open book exams, didn't we?
Maybe.
I think so. Yeah, we'll link to them in the phone. We'll link to it in the show notes.
Thanks. Unfortunately, we are out of time. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a second to leave a review or rating on iTunes. We would really appreciate it. And you can subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com. Or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. And as you saw in this episode, we might even answer your question. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon. Good luck with your outlining.